Oh, what's up, everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and on this episode of Coding with the Force, we're going to go over what the Apex Common Library is and how you can leverage it to implement the separation of concerns design principle in your Salesforce org. Alright, guys, so welcome to episode 2 of the Separation of Concerns tutorial series that I'm putting together for you all so that hopefully it is easier for all of you to implement the separation of concerns design principle in your respective Salesforce orgs. So in this video, I just want to kind of go over what the Apex Common Library is, why you might want to use it, and how it fits into the larger picture of separation of concerns. I'm also probably going to go over a couple of things that is important for you to know that we'll go over in subsequent videos. So, first things first, what is the Apex Common Library? The Apex Common Library is an open source library, so all that really means, to simplify it anyway, is that you can leverage this library for free. You can come here to this page that I'm showing you right now that I'll put in a link in the description and place the code in your org to be able to leverage it. But what is it exactly? It is a library that provides an excellent groundwork for you to be able to leverage separation of concerns within your Salesforce org, specifically in your code base. So, an important thing that I think a lot of people get confused about is that, like I just said, this is just a foundational layer for separation of concerns. You don't download this library and then you just magically have separation of concerns in your org. You still have to do a lot of work, and we'll go over all the work that has to be done in later videos, but basically what this does is it sets an excellent foundation of that allows you to implement separation of concerns in your org. And so it's just an important distinction. I think this library gets there's a lot of confusion around what it does. And I think that's really just primarily because there's not a lot of good publicly available resources explaining this Apex Common Library, how to implement it, all that kind of stuff. Basically, the only thing that exists is Andrew Fawcett's book, or Andy Fawcett's book, which goes over the Apex Common Library pretty in depth. But it's kind of an expensive book. That being said, I mean, it is a big book and it does have a lot of great information. Additionally, it's very hard to get through. So, I've read basically the entire thing, but it's not an easy read. So, while it's an excellent contribution and it does make it easy to understand this library, it is pretty much the only way to learn this library currently if you want to learn it. So I think most of the community is just a little confused, like, cool, this nice library exists to create a foundation for separation of concerns in my org, but what does that mean and how do I implement it? Well, that's what this series is kind of for. So, stick around and I'll show you all, at least most of the things. As far as why you would want to use it, you would want to use this library because there's really no point in reinventing the wheel, right? If you want to implement separation of concerns in your org, which I just want to tell you right now, you do want to implement separation of concerns in your org. Trust me. Even if you don't see that now, you're going to see it eventually if your org doesn't tank and die in a year or something. If you want to implement separation of concerns, there's a lot of stuff you have to take into consideration if you want to be able to do it to the best of your ability, right? If you went out and did this on your own, chances are you'd probably do okay. But this just has so much in it that's pre-built that's quite frankly pretty excellent, considering how much thought and effort had to go into figuring out how you can create these service, domain, and selector layers in a way that's basically universally acceptable for any org implementation or managed package implementation that you could think of, right? So it's basically, why reinvent the wheel? If you want to implement separation of concerns, this library exists. It's excellent. Either use it or another library like it. Don't try and reinvent that foundational layer for separation of concerns implementation. Okay, so we covered the what. We covered the why. What am I on now? The third thing I was going to talk about is how this fits into the larger picture of separation of concerns, but I'm pretty sure that from all the talking earlier, you've probably got the picture, right? So, past that, there are a few things that are important that you understand ahead of time before you try to start implementing this library. There are 4 object-oriented programming concepts that are very prevalent in this library that are, I suppose, pretty important that you understand if you're not familiar with them. I will have tutorials on them eventually. I'm not sure they'll be part of this series in particular, but you do need to understand what inheritance is, what polymorphism is, what encapsulation is, and what interfaces are. And I'm not going to go super in depth with those, but I'll just briefly explain what they are. Inheritance is when basically a class inherits publicly accessible methods and variables from a parent class, right? So I have this cases class that extends the fflib SObject domain, which is one of the major classes in that library that you'll need to familiarize yourself with. And basically what I'm doing here is by extending this class, I am inheriting all of its publicly accessible methods and variables within it, right? And that's pretty important. It's important that you understand this principle because this is how the foundational layer is set up through this inheritance concept of object-oriented programming. The second thing that is important for you to understand, right? I guess I've already gone over them, but polymorphism. And polymorphism basically says, it's when a class uses overloaded methods or overrides an inherited class's methods, right? So there is a lot of polymorphism that will be taking place when you are building out your subclasses, right? So this cases class is a subclass of fflib SObject domain. And within the fflib SObject domain, there is a method called onApplyDefaults that I have the ability to override and give my own implementation of for this cases class. And this is basically polymorphic behavior, right? So for this subclass, I'm saying, okay, forget about your original implementation in this fflib SObject domain class. I want to make my own, and I want it to run the way that is appropriate for for this cases class, right? So polymorphism, really important to understand. Another pretty important concept to understand is encapsulation. Basically, only making available methods that you need to be available to implement your, or really that you need to make available for other classes to use it, right? So, say for instance, I didn't need this onValidate method to be publicly available, which in all likelihood, maybe I don't. I could set this as private, and that would encapsulate it so that only this class had access to it, right? This cases class had access to it. And it's important that you do this, especially in your service layer, and, well, really every layer, but especially in your service layer and your domain layers, because if you don't, it's, you're opening up your code to be leveraged in ways that it was not intended to be leveraged, right? So understanding encapsulation is super important. Otherwise, you could implement all this stuff and still not really do it appropriately and, in a bit of a dangerous way, I suppose. And then the other thing that's important is just understanding what interfaces are and how to implement an interface, right? Basically, an interface more or less is a contract that's saying, hey, let's see if I have this up. No, I don't, but I don't have anything in here. But say, for instance, I said, I declared a method in here, like, let's see, list of accounts, get accounts, or something along those lines, right? Say, for instance, in this interface, I just add this one method signature in here, right? Well, in this cases class now, you can see it's complaining. It's like, hey, you haven't implemented this method. And so to appropriately implement the interface, I need to create this method signature. List account, get accounts. And now it'll stop complaining, right? Because I've now implemented this interface and it's happy about it, although I'm not returning a list of accounts currently in this method, so it's still a little upset. But basically, those are the four most important things that you understand, right? Those four object-oriented programming concepts are going to be pretty important for you to have a grasp on. And there are some other important things that we'll talk about in the other videos that have to do with typing, right? This class is now of type cases interface if I wanted to type it that way, but we'll get into that eventually. You can kind of see this done here. There are also 4 design patterns that are important for you to understand, just so that you don't get lost or confused, I suppose, whenever we go over the different layers. I also eventually will create tutorials on these, although I'm not exactly sure if they fit into this tutorial series. They'll probably be in one where I kind of go over object-oriented design principles and or maybe one with design patterns, we'll see. But there are 4 design patterns: the factory design pattern, the unit of work design pattern, the template method design pattern, and the builder pattern. And the factory design pattern is important because one of the major classes, the fflib where is it? Application class uses the factory pattern pretty heavily in it. You can even see their method declarations or unit of work factory, things along those lines, right? So you can imagine the factory pattern is pretty prevalent, at least within the FFlib application class, which is one of the 4 major classes that you should, familiarize yourself with. There's also the unit of work design pattern class, which of course is very prevalent, and yet in the second of the major classes to familiarize yourself within this library, which is the FFlib S object unit of work class. It uses the unit of work design pattern to basically register all of the inserts and updates that you might be doing in an Apex transaction, or in the same executional context, and basically handle all of those at the exact same time. If you're not familiar with what the unit of work pattern is, it's very important, I would say, to leverage this library. The third design pattern is the template method design pattern, which is prevalent in the third major class in this library, which is the FFlib S-object domain. It uses the template design pattern or template method design pattern pretty heavily in it. So if you want to, look at this class and not get confused by how it operates, it is important to understand that design pattern. And last but not least, the fourth design pattern and the fourth major class to familiarize yourself with in this library is the builder pattern, which is, it's used within the FFlib S-object selector class, right? And it's used down in the query factory, wherever that is, in here. So there is a query factory that you can use to basically build your queries in a really nice way, and it uses the builder pattern. And so if you want to look through this code base here in the S-object selector and not be kind of confused every once in a while, if you take the time to learn what the builder pattern is, then this class will be not as big of a deal to take a look through and get used to. So those are the major things that, if you have familiarity, maybe I said that right, with those 4 design patterns and those 4 object-oriented concepts, you'll be a lot more successful implementing this library in your org. And just to reiterate it, I kind of went over it when we were looking through this. There are 4 major classes that are more important than any other classes in this entire gigantic library that you see here. I guess it's not gigantic, but it's a lot of classes. There are 4 major classes that you need to familiarize yourself: the FFlib application class, the FFlib S-object unit of work class, the FFlib S-object domain class, and the FFlib S-object selector class. These are the ones that you're going to be working with virtually 100% of the time until you get into mocking. And then technically that's a different library. That's the Apex Mocks library. But these are the important ones. If you familiarize yourself with these classes, the methods available within them for you to leverage, and how they work, then it's going to be pretty easy for you to deal with whatever you need to deal with, when you're messing around with this library. Oh yeah, one other thing I just want to go over real quick, because I think a lot of people are concerned about this and maybe don't understand this or whatever. This Apex Common Library is no longer owned by Financial Force. It's not like maintained by them. They don't really actually have anything to do with it anymore. The only reason that the fflib exists in front of Apex Common anymore is purely 110% for backwards compatibility. That's it. Financial Force has nothing to do with this. It's just really an artifact of its origins from Andy Fawcett's time there at Financial Force. So just for those who might be concerned about that, don't be. It's open to the public. It'll always be open to the public. It's not really even associated with Financial Force anymore. It just has this here for backwards compatibility purposes. So for those who are concerned, please be concerned no more. All right, so I think I've covered all the things that are important. I even added a little more about object-oriented programming concepts than I anticipated I would, but you know, it is what it is. Okay, so in the next couple videos, we're going to go over the fflib application class and the fflib subject unit of work class, and that's primarily because in the episodes where we go over the, how to implement the selector layer, the service layer, the domain layer with the Apex Common library, those two classes and how to leverage them will become pretty important. So if you're interested in that, stick around. There's a whole bunch of videos in this tutorial series, and hopefully it makes everybody's life a little bit easier and makes the Apex Common framework easier and separation of concerns easier to implement as well. So that's it for this episode, guys. Thanks for sticking around for it if you've gone this far. And I'll see you all next time.